So far, we have looked at such a fantastic range of techniques for creating different visualizations. But I couldn't help notice that up to now, all the data was nicely prepared for us. Now, in my experience, that is usually not the case.
You are so right. More often than not, we're presented with a ton of raw data that we have to somehow extract the information we need. There are a lot of ways of doing this, but one of the easiest ways is to use a pivot table, and that's what we're going to focus on this week.
How would you define a pivot table for our learners?
A pivot table is basically an answer to a specific question, like what were my sales per quarter, or what percentage of orders shipped last week. A pivot table summarizes and filters the data according to our specifications and does all the calculations for us. So all we need to do is frame the question.
Nikki, you make it sound very simple.
Well, it is once you understand how it works.
I agree that the mechanics are quite simple, and the videos will explain these in some detail. But I think often the difficulty comes even before that. We have this mass of data, let's say sales data, and we want to know how well the business is performing. How do we translate that into a pivot table?
That's a really good question, and often it will take discussion with stakeholders and several iterations to get it right, but it's easy if we understand a few key concepts. Think of our data as containing two key components, attributes and metrics. Attributes are how we categorize data, so region, retailer. These give us the context. Metrics are what we quantify. They're usually the numbers in our data, so things like cost and revenue. Pivot tables then give us a third component, a measure. These are the calculations we perform, like total revenue. So coming back to your example, we might start with a broad question like, what were my total sales? But the answer doesn't really tell us very much because it doesn't have any context. So refining our question, we can use the pivot table to ask how much of my sales increased from the previous year for each region. And this will produce a useful measure of how our business is performing.
That makes sense, and I suppose because it's all drag and drop, we can easily change and manipulate the attributes and the metrics to refine our questions. What if we wanted to focus on a specific subset of the data?
Well, that's another thing that pivot tables do really well. There are a lot of options for filtering them so that we can seamlessly slice and dice our data.
We also have a surprisingly wide range of tools for making our pivot tables look good, and we can even apply conditional formatting.
And custom number formatting. And of course, most importantly, we can present our pivot data using pivot charts, which we'll look at in the last video.
So easy to create and change, great visualizations, no complex formulas needed. Are there any downsides?
Well, it is important to be aware that pivot tables do not immediately update if the underlying data changes, so they do need to be refreshed.
Good point. But as long as you put the original data in a table, all you need to do is click the refresh button.
Absolutely. Just make sure your users are aware of this. I think for me, one of the limitations of traditional pivot charts is they only pull data from a single source. And I do find that the calculations we can perform are a little bit limited. The great news is that all this has changed with Power Pivot and DAX. We won't actually be covering those in this course, but what we're going to do is lay a really solid foundation to allow us to explore these power options in the next course.
One last question. So we create all these pivot tables and charts, and typically they're all sitting in separate worksheets. How do we make this information more accessible to our audience?
It's often a really good idea to pull it all together in a single report or dashboard, and that's exactly what we'll be looking at next week.
So much to look forward to. This week is so action-packed, we have not just 5, but 6 videos for you, covering creating pivot tables, formatting, grouping and sorting data, filtering data, calculated fields and items, and pivot charts. If you are new to pivots, don't feel overwhelmed. Download the quick reference guide to help you. And of course, we have another practice challenge where you can apply these skills in a different context. There's also an assessment this week covering content from week 3 and this week. So keep practicing.